Electra's plan had been calibrated down to the smallest, coldest detail. Everything about it smelled like revenge and certainty, not the messy, half-formed hatred people mistake for vengeance. She had rehearsed her steps in the quiet hours when the house slept and memory was a sharpened blade. How she would move through Bill's living room. How she would fold her face into the right expression. How she would speak softly enough to lower Luna's guard. Will, loyal in his confusion, had become the instrumental accomplice. Coaxed by promises and fears Electra knew how to plant. Promises that it would all be over. That there would be answers. That it would be justified. He drove her to Bill's door just before dusk as if this were a routine visit. As if the night air that fluttered the curtains could not smell what had already been planned. Electra walked in with a composure that belonged to someone who had practiced grief like a script. She spoke of wanting to talk. Of needing a private conversation with Luna about something intimate and impossible to say in public. Words about adoption. About a future. About a choice to give Luna's unborn child a life away from chaos. Those words were a velvet mask. Luna, exhausted from the months of rumors, accusations, and the slow erosion of safety around her, softened. She was the kind of person who leaned toward hope when the alternative was perpetual dread. She closed the door behind them, and for a breath the house felt like it might hold a peaceful exchange. Two women alone, a confession on one side, a proposal on the other. Will waited in the adjacent room, a sentinel who had been told to stay and be ready, who had been convinced that this meeting was necessary and that nothing would go wrong if he did as he was told. Electra's voice was low and practiced. She spoke of futures and arrangements, of how she could take the child and provide the security Luna could not promise herself. She used phrases that landed like small, harmless stones, each one designed to distract just long enough. Luna listened with the slow, careful hope of someone trying to imagine a way forward. Then the room changed its temperature. The small shift in posture. The sudden tightening of Electra's jaw. The way her fingers closed on the outline of something hidden beneath her coat. It happened in an instant that felt like both an eternity and a snapped thread. A movement toward Luna, sudden and precise. What followed was violence, swift and terrible in its efficiency. Electra struck. Luna's initial shock translated into a cry that was raw and immediate and honest. An alarm that hurt the air. Will, hearing that sound, moved with the instinctive urgency of any friend who had been trained by life to respond to danger. He burst into the room to find Luna on the floor, body folded in an ugly, unnatural way, a look of stunned betrayal on her face. Electra stood over her, the knife still gripped in her hand, not trembling, not pleading, steady in the way of someone who had decided the world owed them balance and intended to collect. For a moment, time refused to be linear. Will's hands reached for his phone, fingers fumbling as adrenaline and horror mixed to make him clumsy and raw. He wanted to call for help because that was the right thing to do. Because it was the only action that could cut through the paralysis breathing down his neck. Electra moved with the fluency of someone who had thought of every contingency. She would not let that call be made. She intercepted Will, words soft but sharp as glass sliding into a wound. She told him the delay would ruin everything. That an ambulance would bring police. That there would be questions and exposure and ruin for her and for him. She argued, pleaded, manipulated, anything to prevent the one thing that could change the course they had set into motion. Will hesitated. He had promised. He had been told. He had believed a narrative of protection and retribution. In his mind, the lines between right and wrong had been blurred by loyalty, by fear that inaction might mean paying a price he couldn't name. For an instant he weighed Luna's life against the maze of explanations and threats Electra produced. Electra's gaze never wavered. She held the decision like a weapon. In the end, the window of possible salvation closed. Luna's breaths came shallow, each one softer than the last. The room breathed with her until she did not breathe at all. When the final quiet came, it was absolute. Luna's eyes remained open for a moment longer. A blank witness to the betrayal that had brought her to the floor where she lay. Electra stepped back as if she had completed something inevitable. As if the world's ledger had finally been balanced. Will stood frozen, the phone warm in his palm, a lifeline he had not used. He had envisioned many outcomes before this night, none of them this specific and awful. Regret came like ice that numbed without burning. A late realization that you cannot unmake what you have let happen. Electra's revenge had been enacted, and the aftermath fell around them like dust. Sharp edges of sound and the dull weight of a decision that could not be redressed. She spoke then, not to Luna. Luna could not hear, but to Will, her voice an even instrument of someone explaining logistics in the face of emotion that might have undermined her resolve. She urged them to think like people who had survived calculations. To hide the evidence. To compose a story that would absolve them in the court of public opinion or at least confuse the path to blame. Electra knew how to shift the narrative. She had spent months studying the ways people believed and doubted, how rumors worked, how a single, well-crafted story could outpace truth. Will listened, the shock slowly curdling into a dull, desperate kind of rationality. He began, awkwardly at first, to follow Electra's instructions, moving furniture, wiping surfaces, the clumsy mimicry of someone trying to erase what could not truly be erased. He found himself whispering to cover the hollowness, instructions about where to put things, how to explain Luna's absence if someone asked, plausible lies to cushion the fall that was surely coming. Electra directed him with a surgeon's calm. She assigned roles, set times and phrases, compartmentalized the moral magnitude of what they had just done into small, manageable tasks, and neither of them would drown in the enormity. Outside, the world kept happening with monstrous indifference. The evening deepened. A neighbor's dog barked at the wrong interval. A siren wailed far away and then faded. Inside Bill's house, the living room was a theater of denial. Electra stared at Luna's form for one more long moment, and something that looked almost like grief flickered across her features. An expression quickly smudged into the hard, efficient face she preferred. Will kept thinking of the life that had been promised to the unborn child. Of Luna's laughter some months ago. Of the quiet fervor of someone who had wanted only to survive. None of those images fit into his calculations now. The future they had all imagined splintered into jagged pieces. And there was no way to put the picture back together without obvious missing pieces. They made a plan to stage Luna's disappearance as something other than what it was. To imply a sudden departure. Perhaps a hurried flight to somewhere safe. To leave a note. To remove traces that would suggest a private decision rather than a violent ending. Electra sketched out details with clinical ease. What would serve as proof of voluntary absence? What would trigger a search and what would provoke speculation? She advised on who to call and who to avoid. On how to steer Bill's inevitable reaction. How to use his influence to direct suspicions elsewhere. Will nodded like a man learning lines for a play he never wanted to perform. His mind already arranging memories into rehearsed answers. They rehearsed the script of shock and sorrow they would deliver to the world. The private choreography of hands clasped and eyes welling up that would make their story a believable thing. Still, small things resisted their staging. Luna's toothbrush, the angle of a photograph on the mantel, the subtle sillage of scents that belonged to the living and refused to be masked by pretense. These thorny residues could betray the lie. The tighter they tried to fold reality, the more it kept bulging at the seams. Every phone call they deferred, every friend they avoided, became another small danger. A potential chink in the structure of their fabrication. And there was the deeper hazard. Electra's certainty had a cost. Revenge, once spent, leaves ruin in its wake. And for every piece of balance Electra thought she claimed, something else was lost. Humanity, innocence, the capacity to return from the act unsullied. Bill, when he was told, arrived with the awkwardness of someone who expects to fix things with money. With influence, with statements and boardroom posture. He stood in the doorway and took in the scene. The rearranged furniture, the absence that filled the rooms with accusation. He moved through his own shock like a man stepping into a cold pool. Hands automatically searching for explanations and scapegoats. Electra, composed and unblinking, met his queries with the script they had rehearsed. Concern, a hint of confusion, a narrative of Luna's sudden need for space and a disappearing act designed to look voluntary. Bill wanted to believe it. He wanted to salvage an explanation that did not implicate him or his household in blood and tragedy. His questions were sharp but ultimately pliable to the story Electra fed him. But news travels faster than schemes can be assembled, and rumors are greedy. By morning, the absence that had been staged would begin to twist into the shapes of speculation. Friends calling, reporters sniffing, social media sparking with questions. The police, with their procedural patience, would ask for timelines, for phone records, for witnesses, things Electra and Will had not fully considered. Each question would be a trap unless they had the perfect alibi and the perfect ignorance. Electra's plan had been designed for a moment. She had calculated for immediate impact but not the slow, grinding machinery of an investigation. Revenge, as she was finding, demands not only fire but an endless tending to keep the flames controlled. Beneath the tactical conversation, beneath the arguments about logistics and optics, the moral landscape widened into an abyss. Will found himself waking in the hours after the deed, staring at ceilings that had never looked so accusing. He replayed Luna's voice, the sound of her final fear, over and over, trying to reason the moment into something he could live with. Electra, for all her outward calm, had cracks too. Late at night she would stare into the dark and tell herself the story that justified what she had done. That Luna had been a necessary sacrifice in a war that had been waged on her family, on her dignity, that sometimes extraordinary measures were required to correct extraordinary wrongs. The rationale was a thin, dangerous raft over a deep, dark current. When the world demanded an explanation, they gave one that fit most people's expectations. A young woman overwhelmed by circumstance, needing distance. Bill made a public statement about privacy, about compassion, about hoping for Luna's safe return. The press published pictures of a smiling Luna from better days in the internet. With its appetite for narrative, stitched together threads of speculation. Some people mourned and wondered, some people judged. But there was a persistent ache in those who had known Luna quietly. The sense that something elemental had been taken from them that could not be returned. Friends who had once trusted Electra and will now watched for cracks, for slips that would betray the lie. Investigators, methodical and patient, began to pull at the threads. They interviewed neighbors, checked travel records, and followed leads that did not immediately point to a tidy explanation. Small anomalies surfaced: an overlooked surveillance camera 2 blocks away, an unintended witness who saw a late-night car idling near Bill's home. These fragments, at first seeming insignificant, began to assemble into a pattern. The truth, patient as a predator, circled closer. Electra's plan, brilliant in its narrowness, had not accounted for the slow, unglamorous work of those who sift facts from fiction. Each new piece of evidence was another chisel against the wall of her constructed reality. In private, Electra's confidence sometimes faltered. It was not the fear of being caught that unnerved her so much as the realization that revenge, once taken, multiplies. It does not simply balance a scale, it adds weight to it. She had wanted justice as she had defined it, but in the process she had become an author of tragedy. The child Luna had carried, an innocent presence that had no part in the histories Electra had been avenging, became a spectral witness in Electra's nightmares. What was victory when it had the taste of someone else's ruined life etched into it? The calculus that had seemed so clear in the sterile light of planning now refused to hold. Guilt accrued interest, and every lie they told compounded into another lie that needed defending. The final, unavoidable collapse came not with dramatic fanfare but through the slow accumulation of inconvenient facts. A neighbor's late-night memory, a voice recognized, a phone ping on a grid it shouldn't have. These small things congregated until the investigators had enough to ask the hard questions. Once they did, the delicate scaffolding Electra and Will had constructed began to wobble. The truth, once given the right place and time, traveled like light through a prism, refracting, revealing, and impossible to wholly deny. What remained after the inevitable unraveling was a landscape of consequences. Relationships shattered, reputations ruined, law enforcement drawing up paperwork that would decide fates. Electra would be held accountable in ways she had convinced herself she could evade. Will would have to live with his choices. The moments he could have acted differently and chose not to. Bill would be dragged into a public war of defensiveness and defense, trying to wash his name in the flood of attention. Luna, the center of it all, would exist now in memory and testimony, in the ache of the people who loved her, and in the quiet unanswered lullaby for the child she carried. In the end, Electra's revenge did what revenge always does: it solved nothing and broke much. It did not restore what had been lost. It only created new losses and a ledger that could not be balanced by a single act of violence. Her victory, if it could be called that, was Pyrrhic, hollow and costly. The longer arc of consequences widened like a shockwave, touching everyone in ways that could not be reverted. People would tell the story differently, some framing Electra as a monster, others as someone driven to the edge by a world that had wronged her. Either way, there was no returning to the life that existed before the door at Bill's house had opened and closed on that night. The city around them moved on, indifferent in its rhythms. But for those inside Bill's house, the silence that followed was a constant echo. And it would not be quieted by excuses, by crafted statements, or by the best intentions of a woman who had decided to settle a score with a knife.